In this lecture, I will pause from the land battles described in parts 1 and 2 to describe the use of the kamikaze as a tactical weapon against the ships of Task Force 58. The Japanese word for kamikaze is usually translated as divine wind. Kami is the word for God, spirit, or divinity, and kaze for wind. The word originated from Japanese poetry and has been used since 1281 to refer to the major typhoons that dispersed the Mongol fleets who invaded Japan under Kublai Khan in 1274. In Japanese, the formal term used for units carrying out suicide attacks during 1944 to 1945 translated to mean Special Attack Unit, more specifically, air suicide attack units from the Imperial Japanese Navy were officially referred to in English as Divine Wind Special Attack Units. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy was close to annihilation and was no longer able to challenge the United States Navy. But after Task Force 58 started to mount air raids on Kyushu in March of 1945, the approach of the United States fleets confirmed to the Japanese military that the U.S. Navy was dominant in the seas around Japan and that so-called normal tactics had little effect in the face of overwhelming U.S. Navy firepower. To counter the U.S. Navy, extremist views regarding the use of weaponry started to appear among Japanese military leaders. Captain Okamura, according to some sources, was the first Japanese naval officer to propose kamikaze attack tactics by arranging with his superiors for the first investigation into the plausibility and mechanisms of intentional suicide attacks on June 15, 1944. He was a veteran fighter pilot who instructed the Yokosuka Air Corps at the beginning of the war. In our present situation, I firmly believe that the only way to swing the war in our favor is to resort to crash dive with our planes. There is no other way. There will be more than enough volunteers for this chance to save our country, and I would like to command such an operation. Provide me with 300 planes, and I will turn the tide of the war. Captain Okamura, one of Japan's most famous senior fighter pilots, became the Corps commander. Okamura selected as his first flyers experienced fighter and dive bomber pilots. These pilots were selected prior to the first kamikaze attacks in the Philippines. The selection was unnecessary. Volunteers poured in by the thousands for the new operation, despite the special nature of their future mission. Here are 5 kamikaze pilots of the 72nd Shinbu Squadron stationed on Kyushu on May 26, 1945. The pilot holding the dog in the center is Corporal Yukio Araki. Araki died the following day at the age of 17 in a kamikaze attack on ships off the coast of Okinawa. On October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Samar, as part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Kamikaze Special Attack Force carried out its first mission. 5 Zeros were escorted to the targets by leading Japanese ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, where they attacked several escort carriers. Here is a model of the USS St. Lo, a Casablanca-class escort carrier. Escort carriers were too slow to keep up with the main forces consisting of Essex-class fleet carriers, battleships, and cruisers. Instead, they were used to escort convoys, defending them from enemy threats such as submarines and planes. They provided air support to ground forces during amphibious operations. Escort carriers also served as backup aircraft transports for fleet carriers and ferried aircraft to points of delivery. They were sometimes referred to as jeep carriers or baby flat tops in the United States Navy. During this first mission, 1 Zero attempted to hit the bridge of the USS Kikusui Bay, but instead exploded on the port catwalk and cartwheeled into the sea. 2 others dived on the USS Fanshawe Bay but were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. The last 2 ran at USS White Plains. 1 under heavy fire and trailing smoke aborted the attempt on White Plains and instead banked toward the USS St. Lo, diving into the flight deck, where its bomb caused fires to result in the bomb magazine exploding. St. Lo was immediately engulfed in flames and sank in 30 minutes. Here is the aft flight deck of USS White Plains under attack on October 25, 1944. The Zero in this photograph missed the carrier and struck the water. On January 6, 1945, USS Columbia was attacked by a kamikaze off Lingayen Gulf in the Philippines. The kamikaze hit Columbia at 1729. The plane and its bomb penetrated 2 decks before exploding, killing 13 and wounding 44. Viewed in light of the presumed success of the kamikaze in the Philippines, the prospects for a successful defense of Okinawa suddenly grew much brighter. IJN leaders argued forcefully that the kamikaze offered the only hope for success of stopping the United States Navy and the American invasion force. Called Operation Tengo, or Heavenly Operation, this all-out attack would feature more than 4,000 planes, conventional and suicide, hundreds of suicide motorboats operating from Okinawa and the Kurama Islands, with a suicide dash by all the remaining operational warships of the Imperial Navy. A joint IJA and IJN air agreement promulgated on February 6th stated the precepts to be followed in executing Tengo. In general, Japanese air strength will be conserved until an enemy landing is actually underway. The Allied invasion force will then be destroyed principally by special attack units. Primary emphasis will be laid on the speedy activation, training, and mass employment of the air special attack units. The main target of the Army aircraft will be enemy transports, and of Navy aircraft, carrier attack forces. Operation Kikusui was a series of massed suicide attacks by Imperial Japanese forces that went into effect 5 days after the American landings at Hagushi Beach. The target of these attacks was primarily the ships of Task Force 58. Kikusui means floating chrysanthemum, the chrysanthemum being the symbol of Imperial Japan. This is a graphical representation of the number of kamikaze sorties during the Kikusui mass attacks from April through June 1945. In this lecture, I will mention only Kikusui 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. There were solo kamikaze missions during the Battle of Okinawa, but there were 10 Kikusui missions with massed plane attacks that ranged from 355 total sorties in Kikusui 1 to 45 sorties in Kikusui 10. 16 radar-equipped picket ships were stationed around Okinawa to deal with the expected kamikaze threat. This defensive posture was conceived by Admiral John McCain Sr. There was an outer ring of defense known as the Ping Line, composed of a chain of 39 ships, most that were smaller than the destroyer escorts, that relied on surface radar and sonar to detect submarines. The 16 radar picket positions, or RPs, were stationed around Okinawa at distances ranging from 20 to 75 miles from Point Bolo near the Hagushi beachhead. The principal ship on station at the radar pickets was a destroyer, but other ships were also used, including mine layers, mine sweepers, and destroyer escorts. The ships of the picket were known collectively as Task Group 51.5 and were under the command of Captain Frederick Moosbrugger. The picket ships patrolled around the clock, cruising at 15 knots within a 5,000-yard radius of the center of the station. The picket stations north of Okinawa were prime targets because Japanese pilots coming from airfields on Kyushu encountered them first. Radar Picket Station 1, located 50 miles north of the beachhead, was ground zero for the first Kikusui attacks. It was not expected that the picket ships alone could defend themselves against a kamikaze attack. Protective air cover, known as Combat Air Patrol, or CAP, also provided fighter protection. The cap was usually composed of 4 fighters, which at this stage of the war were primarily F-6F Hellcats. The cap was assigned to fly above a particular sector. To improve the chance that a kamikaze would hit its intended target, it should crash the ship in a low dive angle of 20 degrees or less at a speed in excess of 300 miles per hour and aim for the ship's beam. When these optimum tactics were employed, 47% of the planes hit their targets. When tactics other than the optimum were employed, only 35% of the planes hit their targets. Aboard the leading picket ships at each station was a fighter director officer, or FIDO, called Freddies. When a radar detected incoming enemy planes, the fighter director contacted the cap and alerted the other picket ships. Other caps were then vectored to the targeted ship. The fighter director officer on the USS Bush at Radar Picket Station 1 was Ensign Coit Butler. He huddled over radar screens and plot boards in the Bush Combat Information Center, or CIC, and communicated with the flagship Eldorado to dispatch and coordinate the cap aircraft. USS Eldorado was the offshore headquarters of General Buckner until he disembarked on April 18. Eldorado served as the Combat Information Center for air defense against air raids that threatened Task Force 58. It was also flagship of Task Group 51.5 under the command of Admiral Turner. The code name for Eldorado was Delegate. By the 4th year of the Pacific War, most of Japan's pilots were either dead or unable to fly. Hastily trained and inexperienced aviators now occupied the cockpits of fighters and bombers, giving the more skillful Marine and Navy fighter pilots a great advantage. Unless numerically overwhelmed or facing an air combat veteran, an American pilot usually was able to shoot down his attackers. Yet some kamikazes managed to penetrate the fighter's shield, and then it fell to the picket ship captain to maneuver and expose the attacker to the ship's beam and its array of 5-inch, 40mm, and 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Enemy pilots that penetrated the cap next faced 5-inch medium-range anti-aircraft fire from the picket ships. By this stage of the war, the United States Navy had the VT radio proximity fused 5-inch shell. This shell, using radar housed in the nose of the shell, detected a plane at a distance. The VT stands for variable time. The proximity fused detonates automatically when the distance to the target becomes smaller than a predetermined value. The reflected radio beam to the VT fuse detonated the shell when it got near the target. The resulting explosion sent shrapnel in all directions, shredding the target. It was estimated that it increased the lethality by 5 to 10 times compared to other fuses. Here is a brief video explaining how a VT proximity fuse worked.
One by one, the war secrets are being revealed. Here's the latest revelation explaining pictures like this, which you may very likely have seen on the screen during the war. British and American scientists and service technicians invented and developed the radio proximity fuse. Vanes, which spin as the bomb falls, set the fuse, which operates as a miniature sending and receiving radio. For instance, these fuses were installed in rocket bombs, which exploded with devastating effect when the radio beams neared the target. A diagram shows how the radio zone of sensitivity spreads from the nose of the rocket bomb to provide the area of contact. This radio fuse was used with bombs and shells, as well as rockets, of course, against the Germans in many battles, and also the fragmentation bomb with radio proximity fuse. Contact is made near, not on the target, and the effect on the enemy in casualties and morale is very different. Diagrams and demonstrations was obtained not only in the results of battles, but from the interrogation of enemy prisoners. By speeding up victory, the fuse saved countless Allied lives.
From closer range, 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns joined in the last minutes of the attack to try to knock down the incoming plane. Here is a brief video showing anti-aircraft fire against kamikazes. Before describing the Kikusui massed attacks, I first want to describe the attack on the USS Indianapolis because the result of this attack had significant consequences just a couple of months later. Indianapolis was assigned to Task Force 54, the gunfire and covering force of the Fifth Fleet. Task Force 54 was under the command of Rear Admiral Morton Deo. Admiral Spruance, in overall command of the Fifth Fleet, had his flag aboard Indianapolis. When Task Force 54 began pre-invasion bombardment of Okinawa on the 24th of March, Indianapolis spent 7 days pouring 8-inch shells into the beach defenses. During this time, enemy aircraft repeatedly attacked the American ships. Indianapolis shot down 6 planes and damaged 2 others. On March 31st, the day before the 10th Army started its assault landings, Indianapolis lookouts spotted a Japanese Oscar fighter as it emerged from the morning twilight and dived vertically towards the bridge. The ship's 20mm guns opened fire, but within 15 seconds the plane was over the ship. Tracers converged on it, causing it to swerve, but the pilot managed to release his bomb from the height of 25 feet, then crashing his planes into the sea near the port's stern. The bomb plummeted through the deck, into the crew's mess hall, down through the berthing compartment, and through the fuel tanks before crashing through the keel and exploding in the water underneath. The concussion blew 2 gaping holes in the keel, which flooded nearby compartments, killing 9 crewmen. The ship's bulkheads prevented any progressive flooding. Indianapolis, settling slightly by the stern and listing to port, steamed to a salvage ship for emergency repairs. Here inspection revealed that her propeller shafts were damaged, her fuel cells ruptured, and her water distilling equipment ruined. Indianapolis then began the long trip across the Pacific under her own power to the Mare Island Navy Yard for further repairs. While in San Francisco, Indianapolis took on a secret cargo. The picket stations north of Okinawa were prime targets for kamikazes because Japanese pilots inbound from their fields in Kyushu encountered them first. Radar Picket Station 1, located 50 miles north of the beachhead, was ground zero for the first Kikusui attacks. Operation Tengo began on April 6th at 1500 hours with Kikusui 1 and lasted 5 hours. The first wave of 27 fighters attempted to lure the American cap to higher altitude. They were followed by 40 Army fighters running interference for the 200 Army and Navy kamikazes. The brunt of the first attacks fell on the ships at Radar Picket Station 1. The lead ship at Station 1 was USS Bush, DD-529. Within minutes, 40 to 50 planes swarmed around Bush. Her guns took the planes under fire. She shot down one before another crashed onto the deck where its bomb detonated in the forward engine room. USS Calhoun closed in to render assistance when she was hit by the first of 4 kamikazes. Calhoun took 3 more kamikaze hits and began listing heavily. Uncontrolled flooding and fires made it impossible to save her. USS Cassin Young, DD-793, moved in to scuttle her. Calhoun slowly sank, taking down with her 34 crew. LCS-64, also on station at Radar Picket 1, evaded all attacks. Twisting and turning in tight circles and zigzagging, Her 6 40mm and two 20mm guns glowed red as they fired. One Japanese plane was shot down before they flew off looking for better targets. The 64 then started searching for survivors of the bush. She pulled aboard 95 men from the bush before heading back to the anchorage at Karamarota. In addition to Calhoun, USS Bush also suffered catastrophic damage. After two more hits by kamikazes, she began to cave in amidships and soon sank, taking down with her 87 of her crew. Several other ships were bombed and hit by kamikazes during Kikusui 1. USS Newcomb was hit by 5 kamikazes, but the destroyer survived with 43 men killed or missing. The USS Leyte, while attempting to render aid, was struck by the 5th Newcomb kamikaze when it skipped across Newcomb's deck into Leyte. 8 Leyte sailors died, but she too survived. This is a photo of the Newcomb following the kamikaze attacks of Kikusui 1. Destroyers were not the only ships to be targeted by the kamikazes during the Kikusui 1 attacks. The following day at dusk, a kamikaze loaded with a 550-pound bomb crashed on top of the USS Maryland's No. 3 turret. The explosion wiped out the 20mm mounts and caused a large fire. The 20mm ammunition ignited from the heat, causing further casualties. In all, 10 were killed, 6 missing, and 37 injured. Maryland remained on station for the next week and continued her artillery support mission through several more raids. No. 3 turret, damaged but usable, remained silent for the remainder of this mission. The Japanese had other suicide weapons. The Ohka, or Cherry Blossom, was a rocket-powered, human-guided kamikaze attack aircraft. It was used only during the Battle of Okinawa, concurrently with the use of the more common kamikaze plane, as described earlier. Although extremely fast, the very short range of the Ohka meant that it had to be carried into action as a parasite aircraft by a much larger bomber, which was itself vulnerable to carrier-borne fighters of the U.S. Navy. In action off the coast of Okinawa, the Ohkas were able to sink or damage some escort vessels and transport ships, but no major warships were ever hit. Improved versions, which attempted to overcome the aircraft's shortcomings, were developed too late to be deployed. The Ohka measured 20 feet in length and had a wingspan of 16.5 feet. It carried a 2,650-pound warhead in the nose of the plane and could reach a maximum speed of 500 to 600 miles per hour. The Ohka, though it had a high speed, lacked enough fuel to go a long distance. To get it near a target, it was ferried to within a dozen miles or so by its mother plane, usually a Betty bomber. The pilot then crawled into the cockpit from the bomber. He was then released from the bomber's bomb bay. The pilot directed his plane to its target by igniting the jet engine and sped away at nearly 500 miles per hour. The bulky Ohkas dramatically slowed a Betty's airspeed from its usual 265 miles per hour to 184 miles per hour, making the bomber relatively easy to shoot down, the fate of most of the Betty hosts and their payloads. On March 21st, 48 Japanese planes were inbound to the ships of Task Force 58 off the coast of Kyushu. 16 Bettys carried Ohkas into combat with 55 fighter escorts. 50 American Hellcat fighters intercepted and destroyed all of them 60 miles from their targets. Some Bettys jettisoned their Ohkas before they went down, but none hit American ships. Here is a photo of a captured Ohka to give some idea of its relative size. On L Day, Marines discovered 15 Ohkas hidden in the bushes near the Hagushi beaches. There was only one successful mission of the Ohka. This took place during Kikusui 2. That was against the USS Maynard L. Able, a Sumner-class destroyer. Kikusui 2 took place on April 12th and 13th. At the time of the attack, Maynard L. Able was patrolling at Radar Picket Station 14. At 1440 hours, 3 Zeros broke orbit over radar picket station 14 and closed to attack. Maynard L. Able drove off one and shot down another at 4,000 yards. Despite numerous hits from 5-inch and light anti-aircraft fire and spewing smoke and flame, the third Zero crashed into the starboard side and penetrated the aft engine room where it exploded. Immediately, Maynard L. Able began to lose headway. The downward force of the blast, which had wiped out the aft engineering spaces, broke the destroyer's keel amidships. The bridge lost control, and all guns and directors lost power. 6 minutes after the first Kamikaze attack, Maynard L. Able took a second and fatal hit from an Ohka. Its warhead exploded, buckling the ship and cutting out all power, lights, and communications. Almost immediately, the destroyer broke in two, her midship section obliterated. Her bow and stern section sank rapidly. Japanese planes loitering overhead threatened the survivors clustered in the churning waters. 2 nearby LCMs shot down 2 of the attackers. The other planes turned tail and fled. The LCMs then pulled aboard the survivors. I will continue this lecture on the use of the kamikaze in the next lecture, Okinawa, the Last Battle, Part 4.